Hello and welcome to the second part of our look at the nature of business activity. I'm Mr. Burden and you have reached the IB Business and Management course run through ibbusinessandmanagement.com, your only specialist IB Business and Management website on the web. Continuing on with our 1.1 topic, we are going to look at factors of production to start with. Now, to be able to produce a to produce a good or a service, to provide a product, we need resources to be able to do that. Resources or factors of production are the inputs, and these are necessary to be able to do some sort of processes to produce our final output or our goods and services that we are going to sell. Now, different types of factors of production that we need to be aware of, that need to be able to identify. The first being land, and land is classified as all natural resources. So not just the ground you're standing on, but all natural resources. We're talking about the sea, we're talking about the fish in the sea, forests. Labour, people, physical and mental effort used in the production process. Capital, we define as being all non-natural, so manufactured resources used in producing other products. And I would also like to include in this definition the monetary resources necessary to provide the finance to get all these factors of production working together. Enterprise is our final factor of production that we need to be aware of. So land, labour, capital and enterprise, where enterprise is being defined as entrepreneurship or the management, organisation and planning of the other factors of production. Someone needs to organise the factors of production into a single coherent process to be able to produce the goods and services, the final products. Let's have a look at the factors of production in a little bit more detail. Look at these a little bit closer. Now, land, physical land of school. We're talking about Queen Margaret College here, actually. We're talking about a school, and we're looking at the factors of production that go into providing the education service that the school provides, or a school provides. Now, land, the physical land of the school grounds, and perhaps solar power generating heating and electricity would be the other example of land factors of production used here. Labour, a lot of labour goes into producing the education service. Teachers and teaching assistants, technicians and support staff, our dear technicians and support staff, without which none of this would be possible. Cleaners, God bless our dear cleaners. And the accountants and the business managers, the ones that look after the school, the day-to-day running, the finance, the ones that make sure that I get paid on time. Capital, a lot of capital will go into schools, large capital expenditure, large capital assets. Now remember, these are defined as being all non-natural resources used in producing other products. So we're looking at buildings, we're looking at the technology employed in the school, furnishing, money that the school's got in the bank, and enterprise, entrepreneurship, the management, organisation and planning of the other factors of production. So we've got department heads, the ones that look after the commerce department, the science department, mathematics department, etc, etc. Management team, those ones that are higher up, your principal, your deputy principal, senior managers. Board of directors, even the higher again, these are perhaps 5 or 6 people that control the direction, the strategic decisions, the aims of the school. An example there would be the finance director. In a more capital intensive industry, let's have a look at car manufacturing, running through our 4 factors of production again, identifying what sort of resources are being used. With land, remember land is natural resources, so plastics, rubber, glass and steel would all be natural resources used in the production of automobiles. Labour would have assembly line workers, engineers, designers, quality controllers. Out there we'd also have distributors and agents selling our product for us. Capital, huge capital setup costs here when we're talking about automotive industry. We'd have a manufacturing plant that would cost billions and billions and billions of dollars. Machinery and technology, billions and billions and billions of dollars again. A stock of components being used to make these cars, and retained profits perhaps if they've had a bumper year from the previous year and not paid out too much of those profits to their shareholders. And enterprise will have production managers, a CEO, finance director, marketing director, sales managers, all these sorts of people organising and planning how the other factors of production work together to form the production process to produce our final good, in this case being cars. Different types of income, 4 different inputs that we should be aware of. Income is returns for factor inputs. What are we talking about? Let's have a look. We've got our factors of production. We've got 4 of these, right? You can list those off the top of your head by now. Land, labour, capital and enterprise. Now the income, that is the return for the use of land, we call rent. Yes, even if we are talking about the trees and the fish in the sea, not the trees in the sea, but the fish in the sea and the trees that are harvested, we call these returns rent. Labour, wages or salaries. Capital we call interest. And enterprise we have profit. So the income associated with land is rent, with labour is wages, interest is associated with the use of capital factor production, and enterprise will lead to the return of profit. So rent, wages, interest and profit are all classified as types of income. Factors of production and the incomes associated with the factors of production. Factors of production, income associated with our different factors of production. Land is rent, labour wages, capital's interest, enterprise profit. All different categories and relationships that you must be aware of. Specialization. It's not often that you find a business that produces a wide, disparate range of goods and services, or one single person that covers anything from automotive electrician to sweeping the floors to software design to heavy labour. But a business will concentrate on the production of a particular good or service, or a small range of products. Well, this is usually the case. Not always, but in 99.9% of instances. Now, within the production of a particular product, there can be further specialization of a particular activity. So if we are specializing in making cars, then there'll be further specializations of different activities involved in making those cars. Let's have a look at the different levels where specialization occurs. Right, let's have a look at the different levels where specialisation occurs. They can occur at the individual, department, corporate, regional, or even national level. Now, at the individual level, people specialise in professions. For example, you have people that are specialised lawyers, teachers, farmers, doctors, engineers, taxi drivers, etc., etc. And even within these different professions, you'll have further specialisation again. I specialise in delivering IB business and management. That's my teacher specialisation, but being a teacher is specialisation in itself. Departments within an organisation specialise in various functions, and within your normal business, these are typically the marketing, personnel, finance and production activities of a business. Corporate specialisation: most firms are going to specialise in the provision of a limited range of products. For example, Dell, a computer manufacturer, they manufacture computer hardware. Hilton specialises in the provision of hotel services, and Sony produces electronic goods. 3 different companies, 3 different corporate specialisations going on. Within countries, we get regional specialisations as well. So certain regions within a country will specialise. For example, London and Wall Street are famous for specialisation in financial services. Murano, Italy is well known for its glass making. Cheddar, UK is famous for its cheese. And of course, perhaps the most well-known example in the world, Champagne. France is famous for its champagne. We get national specialisations as well. Countries also specialise, and some do this more than others. Japan and Germany are renowned for their manufacturing. France and America have thriving agricultural industries. French wines, German cars, Japanese electronics, Brazilian coffee, South African gold, Scottish whisky, and Belgian chocolates are all examples of different national specialisation. Right, we have advantages and disadvantages of specialisation. We get increased productivity with specialisation. Output tends to increase because the business uses specialised machinery and their staff are more proficient at what they do. We get increased efficiency with specialisation. There is better use of scarce resources with specialisation. Less time and resources are wasted simply because employees are more competent. Average costs of production are likely to fall as a result. Standardization. Specialization results in product specifications being consistently met. If you specialize in doing something, you tend to get quite good at doing it. Specialized machinery, for instance, will mean that output is of the same standard and quality. And hopefully with specialization comes higher profit margins. Customers could be prepared to pay a higher price for specialist goods and services. Highly specialized professionals are therefore able to make a relatively large amount of product. For example, suppliers of custom-made cars, divorce lawyers, cosmetic surgeons, architects, interior designers, and professional footballers. Everybody apart from poor business and management teachers. Disadvantages. With specialization come a few disadvantages that we must be aware of as well. So the cons of specialization. Boredom. People are likely to become fed up with doing the same repetitive task. You specialize in something, you do it over and over and over. And if people do become bored, if the task is seen as monotonous, this can negatively affect the level of staff productivity and motivation. Inflexibility. Employers who specialise or over-specialise in doing a certain task or job will be less flexible as they lack the skills and opportunities to develop to different roles and responsibilities. Workers who over-specialise may find it difficult to switch to alternative occupations if there's an adverse change in demand for their products or services. We see this with people that are made redundant from their professions, their jobs, their occupations. If they're in a highly specialised role, it's very unlikely they're going to be able to pick up another job in the exact same role. And because they're specialised in doing what they do, perhaps the skills they learn are not applicable to a new type of role. There's a lack of autonomy. Specialisation results in interdependence in the production process. A breakdown or delay in one part of the process will cause problems for the entire business. And one that is not shown up on the screen in front of you, capital costs. Now, often specialisation involves highly specialised equipment. Now, the purchase and maintenance of specialist machinery and equipment may be extremely expensive and therefore could exhaust much of the firm's finances. Within any organisation, there are different functional specialities, business functions. We'll take finance, human resources, marketing and production. We use all these functions of business to produce our end product. Now, coincidentally or not, finance, human resources, marketing and production are the next four topics in the IB Business and Management course. So very important business functions, so important in fact that we are going to be spending the bulk of our 2 years looking at these 4 business functions. Sectors of business: primary, secondary and tertiary. The primary business sector is involved in the cultivation or extraction of natural resources. Natural resources being anything from what we grow in the land, what we harvest in the seed, what we mine from underground. Secondary is defined as being the construction and manufacturing of physical products, construction and manufacturing industries. Tertiary, the provision of services to customers. So there we've got the key points outlined in red associated with each of our business sectors. Primary is all about natural resources. Secondary, the construction and manufacturing. And tertiary is about services. So we cultivate potatoes, therefore they're primary. We manufacture potato chips. We take our potatoes, we turn them into chips with some sort of industrial process. Manufacturing. Chips are a physical product. And then a service is we provide a restaurant meal to our customers. So the provision or retailing is service sector industry, and this is tertiary business sector. Right, high level stuff here. Changes in economic structure. Right. As an economy develops, it gets more advanced. Economic activity shifts, which makes perfect sense. If you think about a relatively poor country, something like Uganda, the People's Democratic Republic of the Congo, you always know that a country is increasingly less democratic the more it uses the word democratic in its name. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, most undemocratic country in the world. Anyway, right. So poor countries tend to focus their factors of production, their resources, their businesses in the primary industry. So farming and mining, perhaps. Farming, mining and fishing. As we get more and more developed, we hit up the Economic Development Index. industry tends to shift, economic activity tends to shift away from primary. Primary will still be important, but as a proportion of total economic activity, primary industry, primary economic activity would become less important as we move into secondary industry, secondary economic activity. So we've developed enough now to have factories that can process, manufacture, and construct things with our primary resources. So China, Vietnam, developing economies would be an example where they've shifted from their farming, their mining, their fishing. They've opened up their factories and they're processing and manufacturing and constructing those primary resources into physical goods now. And then finally we get developed economies, and the focus is now predominantly on tertiary economic activity, the provision of services. Right. Here we have it in diagrams. So lesser developed economies, their economic activity would have primary industry as forming the greatest proportion of their total economic activity. Manufacturing would be important, less so than primary businesses, and services would be very undeveloped, lesser developed economies. Moving into developing economies or emerging markets, primary industry is still important, but now in emerging markets, manufacturing takes over. Manufacturing industries are expanding. They're becoming the predominant force in an economy. They're proportionally the largest sector of economic activity. Primary will still be large, manufacturing forming the bulk, and services beginning to develop, but still likely to be very undeveloped. Developing but undeveloped, you know what I mean. And finally, let's have a look at developed economies. Here, services form the bulk of economic activity. Manufacturing has taken a backseat. Perhaps it's been outsourced to different countries. And primary industry now forms a very small part of most developed economies' total economic activity. So there's a shift from primary to manufacturing through to services. Right, I'd like to run you through this in a little bit more detail. Let's have a look at the UK. A short video and their explanations of their changes in economics.
In the labour market. For a transcript, email info@ons.gov.uk. Firstly, looking at this graph, we will show how average hours for everyone in employment have changed since 1992, looking at April to June of each year. Plotting the line for everyone in work, we can see that over the period there has been a fall in the average working week, falling from around 38.1 hours in 1992 to around 36.3 hours in 2011. If we look at some of the major sectors of the UK economy, we see some differences in the average working week. People working in construction have tended to work the longest weekly hours, followed by those in manufacturing, while people working in the service sector tend to work shorter hours. One thing we can note on this graph is that in the construction sector, there has been a fall of around 3 hours in the average working week over the past decade. What is important to understand when considering the fall in average hours over the period is the influence of a changing economy in the UK. To illustrate this, we will firstly look at April to June 1992 and bring up this pie chart to show the share of employment across the different sectors. What we see is that around 68% was in the service sector, 21% in manufacturing, 7% in construction, and 4% in other areas such as agriculture. Now looking at April to June 2011, and again bringing up a pie chart, and now putting on the percentages, what we see is that overall the service sector has a larger share of employment in 2011 compared to 1992, and whilst this has gone up, the share of employment in manufacturing has gone down. So, why is this important? If we return to the first chart shown, we see that people working in manufacturing tend to work on average longer hours than those in the service sector. So if we have more people employed in the service sector and fewer in manufacturing, this will act to reduce the average hours for the whole of the UK workforce. Everything else was kept the same. For example, within the sectors there was no fall in the pattern of hours worked. If we look at part-time working in the UK since 1992, we can see that the share of total employment that is part-time has been steadily increasing from around 24% in 1992 to 27% in the second quarter of 2011. Another thing that is also interesting to look at is the percentage of people working part-time but would like to work full-time. We can see that following the end of the 1990s recession, which was around 14%, then fell as the economy recovered. It started to rise again from around 2004, with an accelerated increase at the onset of the most recent recession in 2008. In 2011, it stood at 16%, or around 1 in 6 working part-time. To consider this, here is the graph showing the fall in average hours in the UK, where the average working week was 38.1 hours in 1992 and 36.3 hours in 2011. This represents a fall of around 4.7%. To work out the effect of more service jobs and less manufacturing, if we assume that average hours worked in each sector was the same in 2011 as it was in 1992, then overall, the working week in 2011 would have been 37.5 hours, a fall of just 1.7%. However, there has also been a fall in average hours within the sectors, as some people have chosen to work fewer hours, or employers have offered fewer hours, and so the remaining 3% of the fall in average hours is because of this. Finally, we will compare the average hours worked in the UK with some selected countries across the European Union. Firstly, the percentage of employment that is part-time varies across the different countries. Looking at this chart, we can see that part-time working is more prevalent in the UK than the EU as a whole, and also for some of the other major economies. It is also higher than our neighbours in Ireland, while the Netherlands has the highest percentage of part-time working at 49%. Countries with more part-time working will often have lower average hours overall for everyone in the labour market. Here is a graph showing the average hours for everyone in some selected countries. Firstly, this dashed line shows the European Union average, which stood at 37.4 hours. Now for the UK, average hours overall was slightly lower, explained by the high percentage of part-time working. Greece worked the longest hours per week in Europe at 42.2, followed by the Czech Republic. Of the 4 larger economies in Europe, Spain worked the longest hours on average. The average working week in Ireland is shorter than the UK's, and in the Netherlands, because of a high percentage of part-time employment, the average working week for everyone is around 30.5, the lowest across the EU. Now if we focus on full-time working only, to account for the differences in the percentage working part-time, we see a different story. Here is the EU average at 41.6 hours per week. The UK working week for full-time people was longer at 42.7, with the longest hours in Greece and Austria at 43.7. Plotting the other countries, they are all lower than the UK, and the lowest average hours for full-time workers in the EU was in Denmark at 39.1 hours.
You could see in that previous video the important point there that in the UK the services industry already accounted for a great deal of employment. Was it something like 68% back in 1992? 1992, and then by 2010 it was still increasing. Had gone up to 80%. 80% of all employment, 80% of economic activity was occurring in the services sector. So the services sector in developed economies just keeps growing and growing. It's a progression. Important term here, structural change. This refers to the shift in the relative share of national output and employment that occurs in each business sector. So how much is the primary sector, the secondary sector and the tertiary sector accounting for of national output relative to share? So how much is that relative share shifting?
Show me. Show me. Show me. Show me.
Okay, we've got two different economies that we're going to look at here across the three different sectors of business activity, primary, secondary and tertiary, and two different time periods, 1950 and 1995. Two countries, we have got China on the left there and we've got New Zealand on the right here. So back in the 1950s you can see that most economic activity was occurring in the primary sector. So New Zealand had a large primary sector, the secondary sector was growing and tertiary was becoming somewhat developed. 1950s in China, primary sector accounting for the vast bulk of economic activity that was going on in that country. Tertiary sector reasonably, tertiary sector small but larger than the tiny secondary sector. And then we can see those huge changes in China taking place. In 1995 we see the secondary sector has just grown so much. Not only has it grown, but it's accounted for now the majority of economic activity in this country. Right. The secondary sector expanded. Those factories on the east coast, in Guangdong especially, accounting for the greatest proportion of economic activity in China. Primary, still important, still a lot of farming, mining, and fishing that's going on, but far less a proportion of economic activity. That change has occurred within 45 years. In New Zealand you can see this is typical of developed economies. Primary has taken a backseat. Secondary had grown, but is now smaller than the tertiary sector. So the services sector in a developed economy like New Zealand has just grown hugely over that time span and now accounts for the vast majority of economic activity within a developed country. Why are we seeing the shift towards services? Why are countries, as they become more developed, shifting out of primary into manufacturing and then away from manufacturing into the services? Why are services attracting most of the economic activity within these developed countries? The first being that higher household incomes allow us to spend more on services. There is only so much food and natural resources that we can consume. Higher household incomes allow us to spend a greater proportion of our income in the consumption of services, travel, restaurant meals, insurance, banking, all these sorts of services. So as a nation, as a country develops, consumers demand more services simply because they can afford to. The demand for services is positively correlated to changes in income levels. The higher the income level, the more services people consume. Eating out at restaurants, visiting the hairdresser, or using financial planning services. There's more leisure time in developed economies. One feature of higher standards of living is the increase in leisure time. As nations develop, people tend to have more time for recreational purposes such as sports, going to the cinema, travelling on holidays, and so on and such forth. Now this trend has provided many opportunities for the service sector. An increased reliance on support services. Businesses need ever more sophisticated support services. For examples, advances in e-commerce have meant a need for after-sales service such as technical support. Firms are increasingly relying on the services of other businesses such as subcontractors, advertising agencies, market research analysts, and management consultants. As businesses grow internationally, they will also rely more heavily on the service of financial lenders, accountants, and lawyers. Okay, your final question for this topic, 1.1, the nature of business activity. I'm Mr. Burton.